Hello everyone, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Building Subtext. I'm your host, Jim Hull. I love great stories, and I built an application to help make more of them. Subtext is an application I built based on over 30 years of narrative study, including my 2 decades in the animation industry as an animator and director for Disney and DreamWorks, my 7 years teaching story development at CalArts, and my practical experience helping develop projects ranging from animated television series to Canada's selection for Best International Film at the 2023 Oscars. Subtext is a wonderful learning experience and a great place to develop your next story. As a recent subscriber told me, Subtext has advanced my understanding of empiric story structure by an indescribable degree. I feel like I'm being mentored by a professor each time I sit to work on a new transit or the next through line. If you're ready to enjoy the same kind of mentorship our subscribers rave about, then Subtext is the place for you. Discover more at subtext.app. Today, I want to go over what it means to write with an objective narrative framework. Writing with Subtext is going to be completely different than anything else you've ever written with before, primarily because it looks at story from the author's point of view, not the audience's point of view. All right, so what do I mean by the author's point of view versus the audience's point of view? Well, the difference between Subtext and anything else that has come prior, like either Robert McKee's Story, Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, the Nut Method, the Sequence Method, anything else, even all the way back to Aristotle, anything else that is talking about narrative structure is always talking about it from the experiential side of things, from the audience's point of view. And we call that the subjective point of view of narrative. Now, the problem with subjectivity is that it's prone to all sorts of bias. That's the definition of subjectivity, is that it's from your point of view, so then all your biases are ramped up into your interpretation of what it is that you're looking at. In sharp contrast, Subtext is an objective narrative framework such that the only meaning that is contained within it is within the relationship between the parts of the framework. So the observer, the person that's watching it, or the person that is using it to write, is not a part of the observation. They're only observing the relationship between things. And in this way, you can see that an objective perspective on the way to construct narrative is the author's point of view, because you're the one sitting outside of it, manipulating the parts into the right place in order to create the meaning that you want others to experience. So you can think of the subjective point of view as the more experiential side of things. So when you go to eat a great meal, it's how wonderful it tastes, how delicious all the different ingredients come together and create that just delicious taste. So the experience of it. Whereas the objective point of view is just, all right, we have 5 parts of this, 2 parts of that, and 3 parts of that. You do need both. So the experience of crafting a narrative and putting it out in the world, you are going to shift back and forth between both. And because of the nature of the way things work, you can't do both at the same time. You can be both subjective and objective at the same time. So they don't really mix. Now you can sort of sometimes see one from the other side, but it's going to be an incomplete picture. So as much as I love the objective point of view and I know how it all works and how everything relates to one another, you don't really get that exciting experience. It's probably a little more dry, but certainly from the other point of view, the subjective point of view, you don't see how everything works, so you're gonna have story holes. So even if you follow Save the Cat and you do all your 16 beats, you're still gonna have holes in your story because you're not seeing the whole thing. You're only seeing part of the story as experienced from Blake Snyder's point of view, and you'll notice that in his future books, as opposed to the first book, things change order. So sometimes this sequence will happen before this sequence, and that's okay because this is just what the author wanted to do. Well, in an objective narrative framework, the order of things has meaning to it because the relationship between those items has a meaning to it. So when something happens here in the beginning and then this next thing happens here, that process of moving from one to the other carries with it the message that the author is trying to get across. So you can't just shift them willy-nilly and just assume, okay, that works, that's fine. Because then you're just you're breaking the narrative. Subtext is perfect at getting the objective narrative, seeing how everything relates to one another so that you can catch yourself and make sure that you're not falling prone to your own preconceptions and your own biases, because everybody has their own preconceptions. Everybody has their own biases. If you didn't, you would have no motivation to actually write anything, to actually create something. The process or the drive, the initiative to put something out in the world is because there's something you don't see within yourself, and so you're projecting what it is that you perceive out into the world so that you can have it reflected back to you, so you can understand what the heck all of this means. So that thing when you hand off your draft to somebody else, or you put it away in a drawer for 6 weeks, or in the case of that clip from Taika Waititi, where he writes something and then waits a couple of years to come back at it and then only writes what he remembers, what he's remembering is what we would call the story form in subtext. That is the objective narrative framework. That's how everything is related to one another. He doesn't remember the specific lines of dialogue or the really cool, funny scenes. He remembers the meaning of the story because he's further enough away from the act of writing it to gain some greater objectivity of what it was that he wrote. The same thing with Stephen King, where he says, put the draft away for 6 weeks and you'll see it with fresh eyes. Or if you have a writer's group, you hand it off to them and you get that objective viewpoint back. You can do the same thing with subtext. That is the purpose of it. It gives you instant objective feedback and pulls you out of the writing process so that you can look and see, oh, okay, I'm missing this part. I should probably think of this. Oh, what if I shifted this here? What kind of effect would that have on the story? It does it immediately and keeps everything in context so that you can have all the fun of just writing. So this came up recently when I was getting a demo of subtext, and I brought up the case of The Holdovers. So this is Alexander Payne's Best Picture from last year, 2023, where I talked about the pivotal elements, what we call the pivotal elements in subtext of the film, and how the main character pivotal element, the Paul Giamatti character, was conscience. And that his problem, from subtext objective narrative framework point of view, was that he was always so concerned with making sure he didn't mess up things for the kids in the future, which is somebody who's driven by conscience, that he never took a chance and never really just went for it regardless of the consequences. So the process of the narrative is getting him from that place of conscience to that place of temptation. And again, because there's balance in everything, there is the main character pivotal element. Doesn't mean anything without an obstacle character pivotal element. In The Holdovers, that would be Angus. He's the obstacle character, and his primary function in the objective story, in the plot, is to show what it's like to be motivated by temptation. So he does things regardless of consequences. That is the balance between the two. In my process of demoing subtext, the other person that I was speaking with, who's brilliant, very smart, knows everything, is like, well, my interpretation was that it was about this, or that it was about this instead. So they're not wrong from a subjective point of view. That's the problem when you apply these subjective understandings of narrative or your own opinion onto what it is that you're looking at. Everybody's opinion is right from their subjective point of view, and then any argument you have over the meaning of it or what it's about will never come to a conclusion because everybody has different subjective understandings of what it means to create or craft a narrative. With an objective narrative framework like subtext, you're not a part of that. So my interpretation of what The Holdovers is, I wouldn't have even thought of this while I was watching the film. The film is great. I was totally engaged in it. I would never think of it until afterwards when I was looking at, oh, okay, well, let's put this into subtext. Where does everything line up? Just knowing there is balance in everything. A main character doesn't mean anything without an obstacle character. So the definition of a main character is that first-person point of view and all the personal baggage. Clearly, that's Paul Giamatti's character. Okay, so then he is in the main character spot. Who is the one that's challenging him, has a similar sort of way of approaching things, but is slightly off balance? And then that would be the relationship between the main character and the obstacle character. Who is telling Paul, hey, you have a problem? Or Paul is telling him directly, you have a problem. That is the obstacle character. And in the case of The Holdovers, that would be Angus. So then once I know that, main character and obstacle character, then the next part of the definition between the two is one of those perspectives is going to be looking at a source of conflict from within from an internal point of view, and the other one is going to be looking at it from an external point of view. Which one does it seem to be? So I'm not judging it based on my interpretation of what it means. I'm not creating this complete narrative understanding. I'm just measuring the relationship between those two and seeing where is the greater source of conflict. And it's not a black and white thing. Sure, it might be more in one or more in the other, but where's the tendency? Where is it more pulling towards? And clearly, Paul has a very, you could say, bad attitude. He's got a very fixed mindset, knows exactly what he's very curmudgeon-y. He's just grumpy. So he's looking at his source of conflict from the internal sort of things. And then Angus is more externalized with the death of his father and him just being all alone. He's dealing with it in a different way. He's not just thinking of conscience because of what happened or the fact that he's all alone. He's just like, forget it, I'm doing whatever I want, temptation. Whereas Paul is locked in conscience because of all the stuff that happened in his past. That is a way of balancing out the main character and the obstacle character, and then looking specifically at their general areas of conflict, the bigger areas of conflict, where Paul is more set in what we would call the mind domain because he's got this bad attitude that is the source of all his conflict, and then positioning that across to help balance it out externally would be Angus in the universe domain. And then from there you look at the plot, you look at the relationship, and everything is related. The goal doesn't mean anything without the consequence. Problems don't mean anything without solutions. Everything is a relationship-oriented, objective narrative framework. And what will happen is once you understand the relationships and what they mean, the more accurate the story form you're going to get. So it's a process of either using subtext to help you work your way through it, or using it to help teach you the definitions of the relationships so that you can have a better understanding of how narrative works. So that's it for this episode of Building Subtext. As always, if you have any questions, you can leave them down below. But I'm telling you, with the latest release of subtext and the new models, the teaching educational part is so well taken care of with the AI integration and mixing it with your story and developing it. I have to tell you, and this isn't just me talking about how great subtext is, the combination of both, as somebody who's been teaching and working with this narrative theory for almost 30 years now, there is nothing else like it in terms of what it does for your understanding of the theory. You'll learn so much, even within the first day, that will completely elevate your understanding of narrative throughout the rest of your life. And then the great thing is it's there for you all the time. But if you're not ready for that, you can always leave a question down below and I'd be more than happy to answer them. Otherwise, I will see you next time.